I remember that famous quote of Carl Jung, which is one of my most favorite. So he said that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. Diba, we would normally say, when we say life begins at 40, there's parang an implication that that's the time that you will start to have midlife issues or even midlife crises. But midlife, or the second half of life, is actually more of a psychological moment than a chronological moment. And when I say psychological moment, we're talking about psychological issues that dawn on a person. As I say and talk about in my workshop, it's the critical questions that come to us that we start to focus on, and that's when we can say that one is experiencing midlife. Now, with regard to midlife crisis, it's a phenomenon that happens commonly, as the name suggests, in midlife. So primarily, it's a psychological phenomenon. And it is usually brought about by certain shifts in the psyche or changes in an individual's thinking. Most common of which would be the sudden realization that one is nearing the latter years of one's life. And of course, with that realization, there's also a greater appreciation of one's mortality, where we are all going to go anyways. No? That is on the physical plane, as we all know it. And I think that's really the most challenging of it all in that phase. It is the realization that life and its possibilities are not endless. And that there are a lot of things, a lot of life's goals that will be left unaccomplished or unrealized. And so in response to that, what happens is that the person starts to feel a sense of urgency to do a lot of things before time runs out. We have that urgency to do a lot of things. So we engage in a lot of things. We panic, and sometimes that is the cause for us to want to accomplish a lot of things before time runs out. Yeah. It just hits you. It can definitely come earlier. Kasi I think that 40, we kind of think that 40 is the midpoint of an entire lifetime, diba? That's why we say life begins at 40. But in reality, some midlife issues or some issues about the second half of life can actually come much earlier. I've had patients or clients who come to me in their early 30s who are dealing with midlife issues. So like I mentioned earlier, it's not a chronological moment. It's not about a specific age, but it's more of a psychological state. It hits everybody, but I think there's also that general rule na when one is very much accomplished in life, I kind of notice that it hits them a little harder. Because what I think primarily, it's because midlife is about slowing down in a lot of aspects. That's physically, but there's the physical or physiological aspects of aging. And of course, emotionally and psychologically, there are these new issues that one needs to deal with. So, yeah. So basically, what are the manifestations of a midlife or midlife crisis? So, from the psychological perspective, more so from the Jungian perspective, the manifestations, or if you want to call it symptoms of midlife, they're always two-pronged. So on one hand, which I think is how we often think about midlife, or typically think about midlife, one may go into self-sabotaging or even self-destructive behaviors. Like one can sexually act out, or one can have people can have affairs with other individuals half their age. Some would be distracted by a lot of fleeting interests to the detriment of one's job and one's career. So there are some people who would neglect their jobs and careers in exchange of some fleeting and superficial stuff. On the other hand, so I said it's two-pronged. So on the other hand, midlife is it's a potentially enriching phase. So for instance, with that realization that time is running out, one may decide to take up a romantic language course, like enroll in a French class or an Italian language class. One may learn how to dance the flamenco, or I want to go to a wild safari in South Africa. So one thing for sure is that midlife is a call to action. It's a deciding point. So imagine yourself being in an intersection or a fork in the road. So you may either go in this direction and continue whatever it is that you have been doing for the past decades of your life, or you may go into this direction and do something different. So as I was saying earlier, it's really a potentially life-transforming phase or experience or phenomenon. So there are a lot of changes that take place in midlife. So that goes for work, relationships. So for instance, in relationship, it totally changes the dynamics of our relationships with people. So for instance, as a child of a parent, sometimes there can be a reversal of roles. So in midlife, instead of your parents taking care of you, sometimes you need to start taking care of them because of all of these. They themselves are also dealing with with issues of aging, and that goes with the physical aspects of it. So for work, I guess by virtue of the fact that, kasi the psychological agenda of the first half of life is different, very different from the psychological agenda of the second half. What do I mean by that? So, in the first half of life, we are normally externally driven. So we are directed towards action, achievement, and basically just satisfying and fulfilling the needs and the wants of the ego. And what does that mean? Diba, in the first half of life, our idea of a good future is basically to prepare for it, and that means getting high grades in school, and then maybe after that, landing a high-paying job, and being financially stable, and perhaps later on, finding the right person to settle down with. But all of these things I'm talking about are mere carriers or containers that we project our feelings of happiness to. What do I mean by that? I guess the most concrete example I can give is material wealth. So we think about, so we say, if and when I become rich, or if and when I have a lot of money is the time when I'll be happy. Diba? But all we really need to do is to look around us and ask the question, how much does a life of material affluence really work? And of course, I'm talking about at a deep or more authentic level. But I guess the sad reality is that the sad reality is that our modern culture reinforces that kind of thinking more and more as time advances, I think. So that's what happens in the first half. Now, in the second half of life, the psychological agenda is very different. If in the first half, our energies are externally directed, in the second half, it calls us to strike a balance between our worldly pursuits and tending to the inner life or the inner world, as some depth psychologists would refer to. In fact, Jung goes on to say that one of the callings of the second half of life or midlife is to reconnect with the divine within. Kasi that's one of the goals of midlife. It's really to connect to that deeper and wiser aspects of ourselves. For the most part, it's an unconscious process. But yun nga, sinasabi that what's important is for us to be conscious about it. Na okay, ito pala yun. Na the reason why there is this urge for me to do a lot of things is because there is a need, an internal need for me to expand myself and my life. Medyo it's a critical period because pwede kasing ang mangyari is we go into a lot of things and spread ourselves too thin. So as I was saying earlier, we need to distinguish fleeting interests from more meaningful endeavors, or else you will be kalat. I think the common misconception for a lot of us is that midlife is something that's maladaptive or even an abnormality. But as I was saying earlier, if we're going to look at it from the perspective na life, an entire lifetime is divided into phases and stages, and each phase and stage involves a conflict that we need to resolve and we need to traverse, then midlife is no exception. It has its own conflicts that we need to be able to resolve. So I guess to answer your question directly, I wouldn't really classify midlife, or even formally, it's not classified as an illness or a clinical problem. I remember that famous quote of Carl Jung, which is one of my most favorite. So he said that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. So according to James Hollis, he has a book called Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, from which I also base the workshop that I give for the CJCC. So he says that in the second half of life or in midlife, there are 3 tasks that we need to be mindful about. The first of which is the recovery of one's personal authority. So it means that, because as children and as we are growing older, it is a natural phenomenon for us to adapt to the world and its demands. So we're talking about the demands of our parents, the demands of our families, demands of when we go to school, the demands of society at large. But what happens is in the process, as we adapt to the world, we develop what we refer to as the adaptive personality. But then, the adaptive personality is not necessarily authentic or real. And that is the reason why sometimes it's also called as the false self. So, one important thing we need to do in the second half of life is to be able to, because in the process of adapting, we relinquish our personal authority. So what we need to do in the second half of life is to claim that back. that authority and that power to be able to conduct our lives the way we want to. So that's the first task. Now the second task is all about balancing our obligations between people and between people and ourselves. I think that's quite self-explanatory, diba? Because I think in the process of fulfilling our obligations to the world or fulfilling our obligations to the people around us, we may have a tendency to compromise our obligation to ourselves, which according to Jung is that lifelong process of becoming more and more the persons we are meant to be, which he refers to as the process of individuation. So some depth practitioners would refer to it as self-actualization, which is basically realizing and expressing ourselves, our more authentic and real selves over time. And the third and last task is developing a more mature spirituality. So, again, I think for most of us, a religion or its traditions, spiritual or religious practices, is something that we inherit in our families. We are born to a religion, and therefore it's something that it's not of our own choosing. But developing a more mature spirituality basically means validating it with our very personal experiences, because what is experientially true is the one that will enlarge us at the end of the day. So there's also the issue of how does spirituality differ from religion? Diba? There's religion versus spirituality. Those are two different things. I think religion, for the most part, is based on fear. And when I say fear, I'm talking about fear of being punished, fear of punishment, or fear of losing the approval of your religious group. But when we say a more mature spirituality, we're talking about connecting to something more authentic and real as we experience our religion and spirituality. So I remember there's a saying, a fear-driven religion is for those who are afraid to go to hell, whereas a more mature spirituality is for those who have already been there and back. So there's a Jungian analyst by the name of James Hollis, who also did extensive work on midlife and the second half of life. And he said that basically the single most important task in the second half of life is to live it more consciously. So we talk a lot about the unconscious in Jungian psychology, which, so remember that analogy of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is what we're conscious about ourselves, and that part of the iceberg that's submerged in water, that huge amount of iceberg that is submerged in water, is the unconscious. So I also believe we cannot be fully conscious. We cannot totally know about the unconscious in just one lifetime. But that should not prevent us from going through the process of getting to know ourselves better, or getting to know the unconscious better. And that goes both informal, and when I say formal, that is what we try to work on in therapy. There's such a framework of therapy we call psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is really all about making the unconscious more conscious. So that goes for all the defense mechanisms. When we say defense mechanisms, we're talking about our ways of coping with life. Because we can go through life unconsciously, diba? Or semi-consciously, if you want to put it that way. So what's important is for us to be a little more conscious over time. Of course, theoretically, they're all important, no? But in my clinical practice, I guess it's 1 and 2. Kasi nga externally directed yun eh. One being recovering one's personal authority, and the second is balancing our obligation between ourselves and other people, which is a very practical issue in our everyday life. Because life is really about striking a balance at the end of the day among all of these things. And in fact, a lot of for the most part, people come to me if they're not clinically ill because there's a certain imbalance in their lives. That's one important aspect we focus on in psychotherapy. What are those aspects that you have neglected in exchange of focusing on just this one aspect? And a lot of the times, it's romantic relationships.
That's why there's a lot of parang new loves coming out at age of midlife crisis.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, parang you invest and focus a lot or you're all in a romantic relationship to the exclusion of the other aspects of your life. And what happens if that ends or when it ends? Diba? You are left with a big void because you have neglected the other aspects of your life. Kanya si Jung, di ba? He was into a lot of things eh. He did not stop at psychology, the science of psychology and psychiatry. He delved into art, alchemy, Eastern religion, Kabbalah, mysticism. That's why he was considered as a mystic, diba? More than a mental health professional. Kasi considering that, yun nga, the one entire lifetime is composed of stages and phases, the process never really ends eh. So for example, for this particular issue that you're dealing with, you're able to resolve that, then another conflict comes in. So there's this book by Thomas More called Ageless Soul. In fact, Thomas More doesn't agree with the concept of first half of life, second half of life. He said that an entire lifetime is composed of millions of halves, or millions of stages and millions of phases. So, I guess specifically if you're dealing with an issue and you work on that and you're able to quote unquote resolve it, it doesn't mean that you're able to master midlife or the second half of life, because something will always come up. Considering that, remember the unconscious, and there are a lot of materials there that may come up in a lifetime. So it's not a linear, remember, it's not a linear process, it's a cyclical process. So individuation is not a linear process, but a cyclical process. If we go back to The Heroes Within of Carol Pearson, so there's one cycle where you start with the orphan, and then you become wounded, and then you become a hero, and then you become a warrior. There are all of these other archetypes. You complete that cycle, and then you start again. So until our last breath, we're going like that. So I remember again James Hollis saying that in order for us to live a larger life, we have to start asking larger questions. So it's a matter of addressing those questions. And we don't necessarily have to answer them. We just need to start living the questions. So I think in essence that is what will make our second half of life more meaningful or more, I guess, authentic and real. I think that's another important aspect, to live with the uncertainty. Because remember, yung sabi ko kanina, our culture reinforces the idea that I need to act, I need to know, I need to resolve. But, diba, remember that saying na we focus more on the journey than the destination. So it's the process of asking the questions rather than getting to the point where we know the answers to those questions. That's the essence. It's the journey or the process. Letting the questions guide you. And remember that perspective na perhaps, di ba, we say we are meaning-seeking creatures. So we try to look for meaning, for purpose. But in fact, there's the perspective which says, maybe it's not only us who are seeking for meaning. Maybe meaning is seeking us.